Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Making the Game from Concept to Kickstarter. I am your host, Reece, and in this podcast, we talk about the development of the game Bloodthrone, which is still currently available to be backed on GameFound. If you are interested, just search Bloodthrone, the Tower of Sacrifice over on GameFound. And we talk about the process of creating the game through development, crowdfunding, production, distribution, and more. In this episode, we're going to do another in our series of in-depth explorations of the various classes in the game. This time we're going to talk about the Ranger. Last week we talked about the Barbarian, and prior to that we talked about the Fighter. So if you're curious to listen to those, you can head over to the GameFound page or the bloodthrone.org website. So let's go ahead and jump in. So the Ranger is like a classic RPG archetype. I was really excited to design this class for the game, and it's been in RPGs since almost the very beginning. Like D&D Red Box was like fighting man, priest, rogue, thief, and wizard, if I remember correctly. But like in D&D Second Ed and on, the Ranger was like a key staple figure in classic RPG archetypes. So initially, when we were designing the class, it was going to be more like the Hunter from WoW, for anybody that's familiar with that, meaning it was going to be like an archer, or you don't have to use a bow. You can use any ranged weapon that's available in the hero expansion, which lets you make your own heroes. But the archetypal Ranger is a bow. So initially, it was going to be a pet class, meaning that they could summon in an animal companion. Specifically a wolf, but the summons all have like a category or a keyword of what kind of summon they are. And the shaman, and the idea was that the shaman and the ranger could both summon any sort of animal companion. Now, due to constraints and the amount of models we could fit into the core box and budgetary restrictions, that's not the way it worked out. So the ranger ended up morphing into more of a sort of like the classic Ranger, where I think most people that are familiar with RPGs would think of as a Ranger as someone that's primarily involved in ranged combat, but is also, like a woodsman and outdoorsman, or that dual wields. That was always kind of the two like sub-archetypes within the Ranger. Of course, now with Pathfinder and D&D 5 and all the other various fantasy RPGs that are out there, there's lots of iterations of that. But the pet always kind of like came into that as well. However, to have parity in the core box and to fit within our budget and space restrictions, the druid was the summoner for the adherence to Zenith half of the core box, and the shaman was the summoner for the iconoclast half of the core box. And then as a quick reminder, the core box has one like pre-made faction. It's called the Heroes of the Last Accord. Those are the heroes you use in the core box, but basically they only stick together for the mission that is the core box. And then going forward, there's two broad factions, the Iconoclast and the Adherence to Zenith. And half the heroes in the core box belong to one of those and half the other. And that's so that you can play PvP out of the core box if you wanted to. It's a limited version of PvP, it's 6v6. But we wanted the core box to give you everything you needed to do any version of the game. If you want to make your own heroes, though, you need the hero expansion. So just quickly kind of give you a recap on that. So the Ranger ended up being more of the classic archetype, sort of like more like Aragorn or Strider from Lord of the Rings, and we wanted to like lean into that classic archetype of like the outdoor-oriented, skilled outdoorsman that could fight in melee or that could also shoot. So the Ranger class, I think it was actually a blessing in disguise that we had to put off the summoning aspect of it until the hero expansion. So in the hero expansion, you will have the opportunity to choose to be able to summon an animal companion. But in the core box, they're a DPS specialist. So they are really good in melee, and they're really good in ranged combat. So you can play them as a sit back and shoot Ranger, which that in playtesting, that's how most players kind of defaulted, was to kind of keep them in the back shooting things, which is really good. But in my experience, if you want to get the most mileage, the most potential damage output, which is what the Ranger specializes in, you want to be shooting and going into melee as well. Like shooting is still going to be your primary, but melee is they're no slouch in combat. They're second only to the melee specialists in the martial archetype. So that's kind of the overall core concept. So they're a martial class, which I explained. Martial classes are classes that are designed to deal damage physically, and their specialty within that archetype is ranged DPS. So every faction will have one martial or character, but their primary function is to do damage in range. We do that just so that there's parity between all the different factions. So for the Iconoclasts, they use the Warlock. That's their ranged DPS specialist. So whereas the Ranger is going to be doing it with a weapon, whether it be a bow or a crossbow, or you could have a arquebus, like a black powder rifle. You can do that. Where the Warlock is doing it with metaphysical abilities, right? Like they have Hellfire Blast, which they can shoot like a magical blast of baleful energy. They can power up their melee attacks. They can do like really cool sort of metaphysical abilities for maneuvering. And the Ranger is focused more on like physical, skill-based skill sets. So their DPS is their bread and butter. The only thing you want to bear in mind is that the Ranger has very, 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 very few abilities to reduce damage that they take. So just keep that in mind. They are a bit of a glass cannon. And they're really good at ranged and up close, but you don't want them to go in and try and face tank a heavy hitting monster, because it's not going to end well for them. Like they want to go into situations where they go into melee and they kill something, and then they set up to go shoot something after that. All right, let's jump into their equipment restrictions. So the Ranger has a lot of restrictions compared to the other martial classes, and this is primarily just because obviously they have to take a ranged weapon in their main hand. So again, really, really briefly, you have a main hand slot, an offhand slot, and then you're whatever you're wearing on your body, your armor. It's a little bit more restrictive than a normal RPG, and that's because you're controlling more characters, more heroes, and we didn't want it to be overly complex. So they have to take a ranged weapon in their main hand, which should seem obvious, and they have to take Ranger weapons in their offhand. So the reason that we did this is the Ranger weapons are there to give you the feeling of dual wielding with a Ranger, right? So Grey Wolf, the Ranger in the core box, he has a tomahawk and a dagger. Really fitting to his archetype. It looks cool. The classic Ranger, for people with D&D roots, usually has like a long sword and a dagger or a short sword or something like that. Like, again, Aragorn in Lord of the Rings had a long sword and a dagger, and I think that's where the archetype obviously comes from. So you can build your own Ranger to have any two melee weapons of your choice. And then from a rules perspective, we made a unique weapon for the Rangers. It's called Ranger Weapons, as I said. And mechanically, the way it works, it's meant to represent them having two weapons. And it has damage 4. It's called a backup weapon. A backup weapon is something that you can take with a two-handed weapon in your main hand. So we did this so that if you have like a longbow or a crossbow or an arquebus or whatever, blunderbuss in your main hand, you can still take a melee weapon. Or if you're a character like Kijo that has a Tetsubo, which is a two-handed club type weapon, that you could also take like a dagger in your offhand. And the reason being is if you have, if someone disarms your main hand, meaning you can't use that weapon for a turn, or for whatever reason, something comes up, you want to parry with dagger, it gives you just another option, right? So that's what the backup weapon keyword means. So the Ranger weapon has damage 4, which is high. Most backup weapons do not have damage 4, or it's not as common. They're usually damage 3. And it has the defensive keyword. That's to represent that there's two weapons. And we did that because we experimented with a lot of things. Like, maybe a reroll to represent that they have two weapons. We couldn't like straight up let them have two attacks because it was too good. In order to dual wield normally, you have to burn a feat and take up both your hand slots. So it was not balanced to do that. So we gave it the defensive keyword to show like you can like block with one and still attack with the other. And the defensive keyword, as a quick reminder, gives you one free parry per activation. So normally when you parry, you cannot attack with that weapon in your next activation because you're focusing on defending with it. What this does is it gives the Ranger their only ability to reduce incoming damage, right? So we felt it was better for the class. If you go into combat and you don't kill the thing that you charge, you're not like, oh no. you get at least one chance to reduce damage coming in. And then, of course, you can keep parrying after that, but then you gain the disarm status if you want to parry additional attacks. So we felt it gave the Ranger a really well-rounded selection of weapons, although it is more restrictive than any of the other martial classes. Lastly, for their armor, they can only take cloth armor, light armor, or no armor. They can't take medium or heavy armor. So typically speaking, with a Ranger, you're going to take class garb, which gives you +1 skill, which Grey Wolf, the hero in the core box, does. Or you're going to take stealth garb, which increases your evasion by 1. And cloth armor only takes up 1 encumbrance, so it's very, very lightweight. Alternatively, you could take no armor, which is called natural vigor, and it gives you +4 HP, which for a Ranger is really good because they typically are going to not have a ton of HP. They have 16 starting HP, which is good, but you're very rarely going to put any stat points into boosting their HP because the objective of the Ranger is to not be getting hit in the first place. So the Ranger's class ability, and again, class ability you always get. It doesn't eat one of your class skill slots. It's supposed to be the quintessential ability of the class. It's just, you just get it by default. So the Ranger has Scout. Now, originally they had Call Animal Companion, but then again, for reasons I explained, we had to 86 that. And Scout is a really unique class ability. It represents the fact that they're scouts, that they're ranging, not to use too many obvious or silly puns, that their job would entail going out on their own and seeing what's going on. Now, in game mechanics terms, what this means is that before the game begins, they get to make a 3 movement point move, which is really, really strong. And I'll explain why that's strong, because at first glance, if you're not a seasoned miniatures gamer, that you might be like, that seems kind of silly. It's really, really powerful because what it does is in a PvE game, when you're playing against the monsters, it lets you move into a position where you can get closer to an objective, out of line of sight. Mostly you're going to be advancing with it or to try and get into a beneficial position to shoot from an elevated position, because in the game, if you're using a ranged weapon and you're shooting from above your target, 2 levels or more above your target, you do +1 damage die. So it's really strong. That's a really simple, safe way to play a Ranger. Get yourself into an elevated position as quickly as possible and just rain down arrows or bolts or whatever kind of ranged weapon you're using. In PvP, it's exceptionally good because you get to see where everybody else deploys, and then you can adapt. So if you're like, oh crap, I made a mistake, somebody can see my Ranger, you can move them maybe into hiding, or someone made a mistake in their deployment, and then you can move to see them so you can shoot them right away. Or when you get more advanced, you put your Ranger purposely in a stupid position to hope to bait your opponent into reacting to it, and then you move them, right? So there's all kinds of tricks that you can do. And then at level 8, you can increase the scout move to 5. Now, the reason why that's so good is that can oftentimes let you move onto an objective before the game begins, which is crazy good. That's crazy good. That means when the Ranger activates, they can grab an objective on the first turn. And there's all kinds of combos you can do, like the Warlord can give them an extra action so they can then, boogie away from it. I'll save that for like a tactics episode into the future, because that's getting into the nitty-gritty of comboing the characters. But it's a much, much more powerful ability than it may at first appear to people who aren't used to playing those kind of games. So that's their class ability. It's very characterful, and really, it's deceptively strong. Movement abilities are much better than novice players would think that they are. Most people gravitate to doing more damage, when really movement for a skilled player is often the most powerful thing. So jumping into their primary skill tree, which is ranged DPS, as I had already said, that's where the majority of their skill cards are going to be. First off, we have Careful Aim. Careful Aim, it's extremely simple. It lets you make a ranged attack with +1 advantage. So I've explained what advantage is in a previous episode, but as a really quick recap, we wanted to absolutely minimize the amount of modifiers in terms of dice when you're making action rolls, because we didn't want it to be, we wanted the mental math to be really low, to be a low cognitive load. We want it to be very, very simple. So what advantages do is those are modifiers that are applied after you roll the dice. You don't have to think too much about it. So you compare your offensive modifier to the defensive modifier, accuracy for a ranged weapon versus usually evasion. So if your accuracy 4, their evasion 3, you get +1 die. So you roll the action dice with your 1+1 modifier. So advantages come in after you roll the die, and it lets you modify the dice. So it's all the modifiers that you would accumulate, which there's not too many. It's rare to have even like 2 advantage. Usually have 1 to 2 is about as good as it gets. It rarely you can get up to like 3 or more. But basically it lets you change the result of a die, right? So if you had a critical failure, you could ignore that. If you have a critical hit, you can turn it on with an advantage. So +1 advantage is actually better than +1 to hit. It's very versatile, right? You roll the dice, you don't even have to think about it unless you missed or you had a critical hit or something like that. So it streamlines the process of applying modifiers. So very, very good. It can increase your damage, armor penetration. It can make you hit when you would have missed, et cetera, et cetera. Really good. Next ability also available at level 1. Careful Aim is level 1. Ranger Senses at level 1. This ability is crazy good. A lot of new players will pass it up. They don't realize how good it is. But as a standard action, the Ranger gives himself the True Sight status effect, lasts for 1 turn. True Sight is crazy. It lets you see models that are hidden, invisible, and through smoke and hazards. So basically, the only thing that can block line of sight for you is terrain. And there's some classes like the Rogue, the Gambler, the Alchemist that throws smoke bombs to hide their teammates as they advance up the table. There's monsters that use stealth like Goblin Ambushers. There's assassins in the game. They rely on stealth as a core mechanic to not get hit. This lets you just straight up ignore it. It's crazy, right? So like if there's a smoke bomb, you're like, I don't care. I can see through it. And a lot of players will not take this card. And it's not always going to be applicable. Obviously, if you're not playing against models that are using stealth, then it's not that great. But when you see that you are, this is like S tier class skill for the Rangers. It's really good. Highly recommend it. So at level 2, we get Heavy Draw. Heavy Draw again is very simple, but you're going to be using it all the time. Basically, you just make a ranged attack and you throw in 1 additional damage die into the damage pool. So it's like if you're confident you're going to hit, like your accuracy is 2 or 3 greater than their evasion, you're like, I'm almost guaranteed to hit. I'd rather just do more damage. This card gets used all the time. Level 8, you get Dual Shot. Dual Shot is extremely good. If there are 2 targets within short range of each other, short range is a widget that's almost 6 inches in length. It's roughly 4 squares. Then you can shoot them both, but you do so with disadvantage on both shots. Disadvantage, there's 1 symbol on each action die that will become a critical failure if you have disadvantage. So that you ignore that symbol when you're rolling the dice unless you have disadvantage. So what this does is it means there's a chance of automatic failure. However, you can potentially double your damage. And as a quick reminder, ranged weapons can only be fired once per activation. Melee weapons can be used twice. Ranged weapons can only be used once. We did that because in playtesting, if a ranger could shoot the same character twice, especially if it was a support character, they would kill them very frequently. They would just kill them. And it wasn't fun. You're like, oh, my wizard is dead before you can even use him. So this lets you shoot 2 targets in 1 activation. Obviously, it's extremely good. And then at level 10, your ultimate class ability is called Hail of Doom. It's utterly ridiculous. But it only comes into play if the monsters or your opponent clumped up. Basically, you pick a square, and then every square with that square and every square within reach range of it, which is every square around it, and then 1 additional square orthogonally. You can see it on the image that pops up. Gets targeted by a ranged attack by the ranger. So it's and obviously this is only once per game. Almost all ultimate abilities are once per game, or all of them are once per game abilities. If you can hit like 3 or more targets with this, it's ludicrously powerful. So with monsters, it's a lot easier to do because the monsters, you can kind of like get them to go where you want by manipulating their AI script. And in PvP, This will be more of an area denial ability because your opponent will be like, oh, I'm absolutely not going to clump up unless they can avoid it, because the amount of damage you can do with it is just, it's utterly devastating. In the secondary skill tree, it's melee DPS. So yes, almost every single card in the Ranger's deck is about doing damage or making it easier for them to do damage. At level 1, you get what is one of, in my opinion, one of their absolute best abilities. It's called Ranger Kick. It's a melee attack that doesn't do very much damage. It's two damage dice plus your power. But the main reason that you use it is because it pushes the target back. If you hit them, they get pushed back a 2 movement point movement. So it's 2 squares orthogonally or 1 diagonally. What this means is it's going to push you out of range so that they will no longer be engaging you no matter what weapon that they have. And it gets the Ranger out of combat. Because when an enemy model is engaging you in combat, you can't use a ranged weapon, which neuters the Ranger, obviously. So this is a really, really good card. If you're using a Ranger that you plan to just sit back and shoot, you don't necessarily need it. Still good if someone, manages to get on you, if a monster manages to get on you or opposing hero. But for a shoot and charge style Ranger, this is invaluable. It's an incredibly good card, because if anybody gets stuck on you don't want, you boot them. And if you do that with your first action, you can kick them off them and then shoot them in the face with your next one, or kick them off and then run away or whatever. It's again, any card that can make your opponent model move where you want to move is really, really strong. Next, we have Whirlwind Attack. This comes at level 4. And this is, it's an attack that hits every model within reach range, enemy model within reach range of you, and it doesn't require line of sight, so you can hit models behind you. Very, very strong. It's even better than the Barbarian's version of the same card. And we did that because the Ranger doesn't do as much damage in melee as a Barbarian. And if we didn't make it really good, considering martial characters usually have a limited amount of cards in their deck, you probably wouldn't take this one. So as it is, it's really good. So a fun trick is to shoot something and then charge in and use Whirlwind Attack as the melee attack portion of the charge to just blender a bunch of targets. It's really good. It makes the Ranger have extremely high potential damage output. Tertiary skill tree, very limited for the Ranger. Their tertiary skill tree is pinned down very quickly again. In the design phase of the classes, they all have their primary skill tree, which is going to be the same for every, it's like every faction's tank. Defense or tanking will be the primary skill tree, and the other two will be different to differentiate them from faction to faction so they don't feel the same. The Ranger's tertiary skill tree is pinned down, which is crowd control ability. Very, very strong once per game. In addition to doing normal damage with your bow, the target is pinned. Pinned means they can't move, they can't even rotate in place. It's crazy. And since the Ranger's weapons are almost always, the Ranger's range weapon is almost always going to be long range. Long range is anything in line of sight. It means you could pin someone across the entire table as long as you can see them. In PvE, pinning down one of the scariest monsters or one of their like magic users so they can't hit you with a nasty spell, it's amazing. PvP, you can pin down like their main tank or their healer or something. Like, it's really good. That's why we had to make it once per game, because it was just so strong. All right, as for the feats for the Ranger, and again, feats, class-specific feats come at level 2, 4, 6, and 8. And then you have general feats at level 1, 3, and 7. And at level 5 and 9, you get a stat boost. So the class-specific feats, you can only ever pick one. There's a selection of 2. General feats, there's more. Those are available to all classes. So for the Ranger, at level 2, you get the choice between Sniper and Hook and Slash. So Sniper lets you ignore the disadvantage penalty for firing at long range. So anything past medium range, you have disadvantage when shooting. So the Ranger can just ignore that. So obviously, if you want to sit back and shoot Ranger, this is an auto include. Excuse me, it's very, very good. Hook and Slash is, in my opinion, it's the better choice. What it does is it gives you the accurate keyword on your Ranger weapons. So I say it's a better choice for the way I like to play a Ranger, right? I like to play a Ranger that's moving forward. So since if you're playing a Ranger that's moving forward, you're not always going to be shooting at long range anyway. You're often going to be shooting at medium range or less. And thus, you don't worry about the disadvantage penalty. And then getting the accurate keyword on your ranger weapons increases their accuracy by about 10%. It's really good. But it's 2 choices that are good depending on both good depending on your playstyle. At level 4, you can take precise aim or run and gun. These are both really good. This is a very tough choice. Precise aim lets you fire into melee without disadvantage, or you ignore the firing into melee rule, which what that means is if you're firing into combat where your ally and a monster or an opposing hero are fighting each other, you have disadvantage on the shot, and if you miss, you hit your ally. It's obviously really bad. It's also really, really funny when it happens, as it comes up a lot more frequently than you might think it would. So that's very, very strong, obviously. Not having to worry, being able to shoot into combat without worrying about hit your friends or just having the disadvantage penalty. Obviously very good. Run and gun is really good. It's a unique feat, something only the ranger has, at least at this point in time. It lets you make a move and shoot action as a compound action, kind of like charging, where you move and attack. Although with charging, you get a bonus. With run and gun, you get a penalty. So you can move and then shoot, but you do so with disadvantage. So obviously for a mobile ranger, this is amazing. Like it dramatically increases their action economy. Both very good choices, right? Like you can't really go wrong. Although again, if you're playing a sit back and shoot ranger, precise aim is the obvious choice. When we go up to level 6, 2 relatively simple choices. You can either take Deadeye, which gives you +1 power, meaning you'll throw 1 extra die whenever you attack with melee and shooting. It's very good. Or Master Scout, which again I explained earlier, gives you extra scout movement, which is deceptively good, especially when you have your ranger trying to make a run for early objectives. And objectives are how you win the game typically, so it's not to be underestimated. At level 8, you can either take Ignore Cover or Biting Ranger Weapons, which gives Ignore Cover is very simple. It ignores the cover rule. So anytime you're taking a range shot and someone's behind cover, they get +1 armor. So this is like basically giving yourself +1 damage on ranged attacks. So you just don't have to worry about cover. And Biting Ranger Weapons gives your ranger weapons the deep wounds keyword, which whenever you're rolling for damage, there's 1 symbol on the damage dice that's a red 2 swords. If you have the deep wounds keyword, it turns into 3 damage. So it can increase your melee damage by quite a bit. So again, just depends on the way you want to play. So the feat choices for the ranger are pretty straightforward, depending on if you want to be a turret that sits back, or if you want to be more like the Last of the Mohicans, Daniel Day-Lewis character that's running forward, shooting, and chopping people in melee. So let's talk about Grey Wolf. He is the ranger in the core box. I think he's absolutely one of the most badass miniatures I've ever seen. I love it. I love it. The sculptors hit it out of the park. So his stats are oriented just strictly, well, it's not strictly for offense. He's built to be very, very hard hitting and very hard to hit. So he doesn't have any armor. He doesn't have any points in their constitution. So he's just at 16. He has the base level of HP. Every level he'll only get 1, or every odd level he'll get +1 HP. So he's not built to take a punch. He doesn't have any armor. He just has class garb that gets him +1 skill. But he's accuracy 4, which is really high. He's power 3, which is almost max. His longbow has the accurate keyword, so he's very rarely going to miss. And he, like Kijo, he has the martial archetype feat of great weapon training, which if you have a 2-handed weapon in your main hand, it does +1 damage. So he's throwing 6 dice with his longbow, and he's adding 3 power dice. Like, he's deadly at long range. But then with his ranger weapons, space 4 + 3 power, it's almost as good. He does almost as much damage in melee as he does in range, which is why I always advocate, like, if you feel better sitting back and shooting, that's totally fine, but you could be potentially doubling the damage or almost doubling the damage output if you also utilize melee for the ranger. To sit back and shoot or go into combat, because his evasion is super high at 6. Once you go above 4 evasion, you're hard to hit. Monsters or opposing models will miss you. Not all the time, but like they will consistently miss. So anything that you want to put on him to boost his HP, to make him more durable in the instance he does get hit, or just to keep doubling down and make him harder to hit. Those are really good abilities. Things like the Ring of Health, which is a low-level magic item that you can find while playing the game that gives you plus 2 HP. Plus 2 doesn't sound like a lot, but in this game, it's actually quite good. 1 damage dice, if I remember correctly, it does like an average of like 1.3 damage. And so 2 HP like is basically blocking 1 extra damage die. So it really just depends on the way you want to play them, right? Personally, as I've said, I like to run and gun. So throwing on like an evasion boost, like the priest has a spell called Protection of Faith, or divine protection. Let me double check that. Yeah, it's Protection of Faith. Excuse me. It's a game-long buff. Game-long buffs are called blessings, and they can be taken off. They can only be taken off by an opposing model. They're great, and gives you plus 2 evasion. So you could have like Brother Bolstan, the priest, hit him with that if you want to, and then boogie off, and then he goes into evasion 8, which is like extremely difficult to hit. However, if you're having Grey Wolf sit back and shoot, a lot of times they don't even get attacked. There's monsters that do flank you, or they will come out from angles that you don't expect. So that's the only thing you really have to be wary of. So in that instance, you might prefer to go with a buff such as from Karl Bjornsson, the Shaman. Bull Strength would give you plus 1 power, and that's also a game-long buff, right? Like, so that might be the better choice, is to just keep doubling down on his offense, and just have him just one-shotting monsters left and right, which is a lot of fun. Grey Wolf is the easiest character to play in the game, followed probably only by Ajax. And that's if you play him as a sit back and shoot model. So if you have someone who's like showed up for the week's, play session and is not really familiar with these kinds of games, or just not really familiar with Bloodthrone, or they're just a casual gamer, whatever, this is the character to give them. Like, oh, hey, take the Ranger, get on top of a building, and then just blast things, and they're going to have fun just like smoking monsters like Legolas. And that it makes it just like such an easy hero to play from that regard. Now, if you're a more advanced player, as I've said a million times so far, consider playing them as a mobile ranger, because it's just much more powerful. It is more risky because he can get knocked out. It's much more likely to get knocked out if you get stuck in a bad spot or some monsters double teaming, you can't get out of there. But if you do play as a sit back and shoot Ranger, Grey Wolf very rarely gets knocked out. It's because he's just too far back. In PvP games, the Ranger or Grey Wolf is very intimidating. Like when you're playing against the Ranger, you're going to be like, oh, it really changes the way you play. Like, oh man, I can't be in the open. I always got to be in cover. If they didn't use the Ranger Census card, I'm going to be throwing smoke so I can cover my advance. You're going to be really mindful of how to avoid getting rail cannoned, which is what we called him. We called Grey Wolf the rail cannon in playtesting. So it'll really change the way your opponent plays. And you want to use like the rogue that can go stealth to try and take him out, or you need someone like that has a shield like Ajax or Amara that can walk forward and block the arrows to reduce the amount of damage that they take. If you can hit them with blind is the ultimate debuff on the Ranger. It makes their accuracy 0, which means they're going to miss like very frequently. Those are one of the things you want to look out for. Taking away their power with Enfeeble, that's another really strong buff, reduces their damage quite a bit. So those are some of the ways you want to try and counter them. It can be difficult though. The Rangers is really good in PvP. The only downside, again, is that they're only shooting once per turn. So in those rare instances where they do miss, it really reduces their damage reduction. And if they didn't take Ranger Senses again, you can block their line of sight. Also, if they don't take Ranger Kick, all you have to do is touch them in combat and they can't shoot, right? So those are like the things you have to bear in mind. It's like you have to find a path to get to them, and then tag them in combat and hopefully prevent them from getting out. And then playing as the Ranger, you want to keep those exact same things in mind. You want to put yourself in a position to target support characters, support monsters, and focus on taking them out at long range, because that's what the Ranger is best at. They're like the long range delete button. So really fun character to play. Very straightforward. The Ranger, like I said, it's pretty easy to play, right? Like the only real trick in it is choosing the right skill cards based on the monsters or opposing heroes that you're going to be facing. Grey Wolf specifically has 3 class skill choices, which is really good. That's very good for a martial character. Martial characters usually have like 2. So he has an intelligence 1. So you always get 1. He has intelligence 1, which gives you another 1. And he has a class guard, which gives him a 3rd. So he has quite a few options. And then as you level up, you can find magic items or boost their intelligence once. There's general feats you can take that give you more skills. But 3 is a pretty good mix. 3, you may want to go up to 4 with him, but that gives you a pretty wide selection. And as he's a human, he gets the human heritage card, which is Destiny. It's very simple, but it's very good. Once per game, after you make an action roll, you can re-roll any 1 die in the pool. So like if you're rolling and then you got 1 critical failure, you can just re-roll that. Or, that's typically how you're going to do it. Or if you have an action dice and they both come up blank, which advantage can't affect a blank result, this lets you re-roll 1 of those. So the human heritage card isn't fancy. It's not like the Onikin where you're headbutting them and like blasting them with damage. But it's just extremely good. Like you're going to use it every single game. Really, really good card. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Ranger, ton of fun, very versatile, very much a glass cannon, hits like a truck at any range, good in melee, mobile, but not built to take a punch. So you want to play it as such. So thank you so much for listening in on this episode of Making the Game. I hope you enjoyed it. Next week, we're going to cover the Rogue. Rogue is probably my favorite hero to play, if not number 1 in the top 3. So that'll be fun. Again, if you want to back Bloodthrone, please do so over at GameFound. Just look up Bloodthrone: The Tower of Sacrifice, and you'll see it pop up. And hope you all have a great week, and we'll talk to you again next week. Thank you.